I'd like to welcome our next keynote speaker, Ms. Sowmya, CEO of Gray Matters, and she will express her thoughts on the topic of making data work in education. Ms. Sowmya?
Data in education, I know it sounds very heavy, but I'm just gonna have some fun. We're gonna go through a bunch of comic strips and learning as we go. And I'll talk a little bit in the meanwhile about what we do as well. So with that, I will start. So a quick bit about Gray Matters, I have to do this. We are an education assessment company. We do over 1 million education assessments in India. And the purpose of us doing these assessments is that we want to move the system forward, and we believe that measurement is the way to do it, and measurement is a form of data, right? And that is what we believe in as an organization. So with that, we'll start with the fun part, right? All of you can see the comic and read it? Can I maybe have it here as well? How many of you are Calvin Hope fans? You read this one before. So this is little boy Calvin who says, I don't think math is a science, I think it's religion. His explanation for that, it's like, yeah, all these equations are like miracles. You take two numbers and when you add them, they magically become another number. No one can say how it happens. You either believe it or you don't. It's a faith, right? Well, it's a fair argument, but math is math. And at the end of the day, we have the reality of the education system that we live in and the constructs of whatever we've been discussing today in terms of, it's a very score-based model and things like that. And so we work with over 70 different education solutions in India, which primarily work in the K-10 segment. And we always see these arguments because education is a very heart-based business, right? It's based on student stories. It's based on that individual student doing well. And data somehow seems very numbery, something very hard-coded that we don't want to deal with, largely because you miss the gratification of working with students. And I was telling someone else, when I was discussing about something else, I was telling them our organization looks more like an IT startup that's a data analytics crunching data all the time. We have very little interaction with the actual student, and maybe happens to a lot of you. But while you keep the student in front, let's, as organizations that work in education, balance the heart and the brain, which is to say that student is at the center, and we feel great when whoever the learner is, whether it is a child or an adult, they make great strides. I think it's important to bring in the piece of measurement. And when I say measurement, I'm not just talking about learning outcomes. It could be change. It could be what is the learning habit you are creating? What is the improvement you're creating? And that's the brain piece of it. And it is going to be hard-coded. And like Calvin, we can all argue that what is the point of literacy if child doesn't have moral values? Or what is the point of moral values if they don't have any basic education, right? Those arguments are all fair and fine. But within our own context, it's important that we look at data with a little focus and objective focus on what is the outcome we are trying to achieve as organizations. A much bigger comic strip. So I'll read it out for those of you who can't see it. But this goes into the next piece about how there is so much data today on all of us, whether it is about our learning or about our shopping habits or about anything else pretty much that we do. And sadly, education, while it is meant for the future citizens of the world, is probably the last to catch up when it comes to big strides that the entire world is making. I'm sure as organizations, you are all capturing data, right, about your learners. And again, this is a good thing. There is nothing bad about it. But there is no thought process to how you're capturing the data, either because you don't know, or you don't want, or you don't know if you're going to use it, right? And then this is a Dilbert classic. Dilbert fans here in the house? Only one? Wow, okay. There are enough there. I would be surprised. So this is a spreadsheet that Dilbert, who's like this cubicle worker, is supposed to look for, and his colleague says, he's asking what is the document about, and he says, this column is the ratio of product returns to gross revenue, excluding sales taxes and annualized, and it's clearly labeled as ROPRTGRESTA, and you're expected to understand it. And this happens to a lot of us as we collect data. How many of you are collecting any data about your learners? I'm sure you're collecting names, but beyond that, their progress or their preferences, the time they spend. Many of you do, right? I'm seeing a lot of hands go up and down, about 60–70% of you. So the first thing about data is, are you collecting it in a manner that is usable, right? If you have a file that is named that, it's not going to be useful anytime in the future, right? So structuring that data collection is important for it to be useful. And when I say useful, I'll get to how we have made it useful, but it is important to understand that you are collecting data, and this data can be immensely powerful in designing your product or your solution way better so that the learners can benefit out of it. I have another. Okay, I'm sorry, I think I did something. Help? Okay. There it is. Okay. So this is a situation that we see in the Indian education context a lot, and I'm sure you have it in your own context as well. This is a boy saying, I taught Stripe, his dog, how to whistle. And the other boy says, I don't hear him whistling. And then his response is, I said I taught him, I didn't say he learned it, right? Which is, and again, I'm glad today's conversations were a lot about learning, which is the outcome that we need to achieve, versus, hey, I did X number of credits, which doesn't mean anything if you're not learning to whistle at the end of the process, right? And this is again where data becomes useful, because it allows you to know whether the dog cannot whistle at all, whether it has started to just understand what the command whistle means, or it has actually started to execute it, right? So that's quickly into the serious part. So that's essentially what we do as an organization, and we do it in a certain focus, with a certain focus, but it is applicable to every single organization in education. And if you've not already started looking at data meaningfully, I urge you to do it, because it can help you way more than doing another HR initiative or another digital initiative, whatever it is. I think having the data that you have to look at and then making decisions on what your business needs can be way more beneficial for the learner and therefore your business, right? So any part of, it's not standardized assessment, any measurement has three different parts. One is the design of the assessment. I get this a lot, right? Been doing this for 6 years, and I still get, I pitch for a large project, and I keep getting asked this question. It's just a test. You have to pull some 10 questions, put it together, give a test. What's the big deal, right? But assessment design is actually a science. There are PhD degrees available in that. It is, so it is way more complex, because you have to be clear about what are you designing for? What is it that you want to measure? We call that a construct. In this case, we measure literacy or numeracy, but you could measure teacher effectiveness, you could measure student engagement, you could measure a lot of different constructs. And the design needs to be very precise. many rules to follow on that, but you can get as close to good design as possible. The second piece is a measurement model. In many cases, it is fairly basic. It's an average score or anything like that. But because we do high-stake assessment, we use some complex methodologies like item response theory, which are used in GMAT, GRE, and other standardized assessments like that. But the third important piece is the data collection, which always goes for a toss. For anyone, whether you're doing it digitally or whether you're doing it in person, it is important that the data is collected from a serious a person who's providing the data with the seriousness of it, because otherwise it's trash in, trash out. So whoever your learner is, they should understand the seriousness. If it is a survey, let's say, for example, that they are taking, they need to be seriously engaged with the survey, and that is a very important piece of whether the data you're collecting is meaningful or not, right? I'm just going to show you some complex graphs because this is all the stuff we do. So this is some of the measurement models we use. It's a statistical model that allows you to probabilistically estimate how students perform and things like that. But I'm just showing this to show that there can be extreme rigor in the process of measurement depending on what stakes you're collecting the data for. Again, just to scare you guys, nothing serious there. I'm not going to talk about it. But I will tell you what we have done. So the outcome of all those processes is we've built a scale that's called Pinnacle, which is progression and achievement of learning. It is a scale that works in K10. It works like a height scale. Think of it similar to a 200 to 800 scale that you get in an SAT or a GRE or a GMAT, but this is built for the K10 segment. And it allows you to measure learning like you would measure height, right? A child coming in grade 3 is expected to be at around the bottom of the scale because he's just started learning. And then as he grows through academic years, he keeps progressing on the scale as he adds more and more skills to his his repertoire of learning. And because we've built the scale, we're able to run very, very large scale assessments for governments, large foundations and bilaterals, and this is also at this point being used for outcomes-based funding. So they make decisions of about a few $1 million based on the data that we provide them about improvement in learning outcomes, right? I don't want to get into the technicalities of it. If anyone's interested, happy to catch up. But this is my life for the last 6 years. The number of years to get data is 3. Number of years to interpret the data is about 2. And the number of years to write about it is 1.5. And then the number of slides I have, which kind of had 3 slides in the past, serious slides, I mean, and that's essentially 1 slide. But again, while it's funny, and that's essentially how it goes, I think what typically happens when you capture data is you're collecting a lot of different data, and I know organizations that have easily 100, 150 data points per child or per learner in this context. But because you've not organized it, like in the first case, or you've not collected appropriately, you're not getting the right insights. But if you have thought through it from the beginning, then that single slide at the end can be very, very powerful enough to move millions of dollars, whether it is funding for your organization or funding for another organization or for your learners, right? So I want to leave you with the thought that data can be very, very powerful in education, whichever context you're working in. And I don't think as a sector, education has tapped into data well enough compared to many other like consumer goods or sectors like that, or pharma and healthcare, which have used it tremendously. I come from pharma and healthcare. I spent 10 years. The amount of data, real-world data that they use to ensure that drugs are being useful for their patients is immense. And the amount of money invested into doing that analytics is immense. I'm not saying all of it is great, but it is, the thought process is a very important framework to have in your mind. Okay. I'm here at the end of my presentation. I don't know how long that was, but leave you with just two things. Think about what is the data that you're collecting at this point of time. Does it tell you enough about your learners? And is your data collection meaningful enough that it can drive insights for your business or for your learners in the future? And that's it. Thank you.